The Women's World Championship match is in full swing, and last week already gave a preview on this 12-game match between Lei Tingjie and Wenjun, the two top players from China facing each other in their home country. And the first 4 games, they've ended in hard-fought draws. And we are going to have a look at Game 5, because Game 5, I believe, is a really instructive game. And good news, we have a decisive result. Let's have a look what happened in this game. White is Lei Tingjie and black Wenjun. Let's have a look. E4, E5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, the Italian opening, and white goes d3, bishop c5, castling kingside, all very standard way of developing. Black goes d6, white goes c3, so that at some point maybe b4 or even d4 can be played. And look what black plays here. It's the move a5, very radical way of preventing white from placing its pawn on the b4 square. But this is modern theory, whereas let's say 10 years ago almost everybody was still placing that pawn on a6. But trying to prevent white from grabbing space on that side of the board has become a very topical issue in the Italian opening. And actually later on in the game we will see that the action is actually going to take place on that side of the board. White goes bishop b3. The bishop is somewhat better placed, less vulnerable, protected, and can later on drop back to c2 if it wants. Black castled, rook e1, bishop goes to a7, and now white goes a3 to stop any knight g4 or even bishop g4 ideas. It's a useful waiting move, and typically black can do the same here by playing h6. That's not a weakening move at all. It can be quite useful, but Wenjun decides to play the move bishop e6 right away, offering the exchange of bishops. Now white is for choice. Do you want to take yourself on e6? Then black has this option of recapturing with the f-pawn, doubling the pawns on the e-file, but that can in fact also be quite helpful for black sometimes. Remember that game between Jordan van Vreest and Anish Giri, which I covered recently on my channel as well. In that game, for black it worked out very well having that doubled pawn. So here we get to see a different plan as white plays the move bishop c2. White wants to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, avoiding the exchange of bishops. Now the move h6 was played anyway. An interesting moment, because I think in these kind of Italian games it's usually the question is white going to play the move d3, d4, or is black going to play something like d6, d5. It's about who is going to grab the initiative in the center. And look, now it's white who decides to play that move right away, d4, threatening to advance the pawn even one square further with a double attack on these two minor pieces. So black thinks, let's trade off that pawn, ed4, and okay, you can recapture with the c pawn, but Lei recaptures with a knight instead, and that's also quite a sensible way of playing, as you would like to trade off that bishop on e6. Interesting moment as black plays a positional move, bishop back to d7, though it should be mentioned that even a move like d5, trying to simplify in the center with this move, may be a very interesting attempt trying to equalize immediately. Not really sure if it's really going to be full equality, but definitely black is quite active. So even if white would take on e6, you recapture with the f-pawn. Black is pretty well developed in that case. Anyway, didn't happen. Bishop d7 was played. Now white goes bishop e3 to support the knight even better. And black goes knight e5, avoiding the exchange of knights. And in certain cases, the knight can come to c4, attacking the bishop. So white plays knight d2, covering that c4 square, developing the remaining minor piece. And here black goes for a very radical move, for the move c5, questioning what the knight is gonna do. But frankly speaking, I'm not a big fan of that move, because the bishop is usually looking for this diagonal. It's nicely placed when there are no pawns standing in the way. So probably this is already an inaccurate decision, and well, white drops back with a knight to f3. Black goes bishop c6 to increase the pressure against the pawn on e4. And now knight takes e5, d takes e5. We have a symmetrical position, only one open file. And now you may think this looks very equalish. Well, I think that this pawn formation on the queen side with pawns on dark squares is not looking too great. Bishop on a7 is quite passive, and particularly white's next move is very useful. a4, preventing black from advancing the pawn to b5. If that happens, you can simply trade off the pawns, and then black is ending up with two isolated pawns on the a and c file. Queen e7 played, white goes queen e2, and both sides are placing a rook on the open d file. Rook fd8, rook ed1. And yeah, okay, black is solid, but as I said, there are some weaknesses on the queen side. And black feels like, okay, now it's time to get this bishop to a more active square. But even on b8, with the idea probably to go to c7, it's not entirely clear to me what is black going to do next. And now we see the pawn on c5 is not that well defended, and Lee seizes the opportunity. Plays here the move queen to c4, attacking the pawn with both the queen and the bishop. Black defends it with the move b6. And now white plays the move b4. Very ambitiously played. I like the plan. And well, now the threat is simply to take on c5, of course. The best option here for black is try to stay as solid as possible with a move like bishop d6. So that if you do take on c5, you recapture with the bishop. And after the exchange of bishops, I think black is quite relieved to having traded off that dark squared bishop. So taking on c5 is not such a great idea. Maybe the move b5 can be considered, but then you may regret having closed the position on the queen side too much. And it's not entirely clear if white will eventually be able to break through on that side of the board. So this would have been a very stubborn defensive attempt. Instead, Wenjun Ju played here a takes b4. And now after c takes b4, these two pawns, they are quite dangerous. And it should be pointed out that taking the pawn on b4 one more time just runs into queen takes c6. The bishop is hanging, so black cannot do something about that pawn on c5. Has to protect it with the bishop, but now white advances the pawn to b5. Questioning the bishop goes away. But now basically every move you've got to reckon with ideas based on a4, a5. White would like to break through on that side of the board so that it creates a passed pawn. Obviously, black already has a passed pawn, even a protected passed pawn, which is looking nice, but still the bishops are not looking great. And I think the blockading square c4 is under nice control. And now very nice positional play by Lee. She drops back with the queen to c3, so that the queen covers the a5 square. Who knows, at the right moment a5 is a possibility. And after bishop e6, rather than having the queen there, the knight jumps into to c4, attacking the pawn on b6. And you're here for a big choice. Are you going to whip off that knight or keep the bishop on the board? Like, for instance, if bishop c7, which was not played, rooks are going to be exchanged. And now I think a5 is an excellent idea. With the point that if b takes a5, you push the pawn to b6. And next move you can take on a5. And white is making a lot of progress with a far advanced pawn. The other pieces are supporting the pawn on b6. Things are looking incredibly dangerous for black. So therefore black thought, okay, it's a better idea to get rid of that powerful knight. But with bishop takes e6, you're giving up the control over the light squares. And that enables white to activate the bishop from c2. White is having quite a nice advantage here already. And well, black's pieces are not doing great. And now Wenjun comes up with a plan of activating that knight via e8 to c7, e6, and then it's ready to come in to d4. Bishop to b3. Knight c7, queen c2. Once again, the queen is making space for one of the minor pieces. Knight e6, and now the bishop comes into d5, threatening the rook on a8. So the rook goes to b8. And here again, interesting moment. Are you going to prevent that knight coming into e6, from e6 to d4, or are you going to trade it off? In the game, Lee decided to trade it off, which is a very interesting decision. Though it should be said that after some move like queen c4, you have a massive grip on the light squares. And even if the knight comes into d4, you can try to play around it, ignore it, or even if you want, you can consider trading it off, because the passed pawns for black, they are nicely blockaded, they're very well neutralized. So then you still have the more active bishop. It's a difficult decision, but in the end, Lee thought, let's take it. With bishop takes e6, queen takes e6, the rook enters on d5. So even here, white's advantage is beyond any doubt. Why? Control over the d-file and a much better bishop, because the dark squared bishop is hindered by its own pawns in the center, which are placed on these dark squares. Bishop e7, making space to contest the rook on the d-file. Rook 81, rook takes, and now rook a8 was played. I think it's probably a wise decision to keep the rooks on the board, not to play rook d8, because potentially this a pawn is quite dangerous, and white is looking for a way to break through. Even pawn sacrifices are quite interesting, as this b pawn is not too far away from the queening square. So black decides to stay with the rook on the board. And now bishop to d2, excellent move. So the bishop is gaining control over this square, trying to prepare such a pawn break. And there's even another idea, which is going to be revealed very soon. Now, a difficult moment, as black basically decided to stay very passive, and I think black should have tried to play more actively with a move like queen c8. And this looks not very active at first sight, dropping back with your queen voluntarily. But the idea is that if you do take the pawn on e5, there is queen d7, and the queen is trying to enter somewhere, maybe on d4, or maybe bishop f6 first, so that the bishop is not hanging. But you would like to attack the pawn on a4. And giving up a pawn definitely gives black more possibilities to generate piece play. So I think that would have been an interesting attempt. Instead, black played king f8, waiting move. But now bishop c3, this is the reason why the bishop is going to be rerouted from e3 to c3. You're attacking the pawn. Another pawn is placed on a dark square. Now the queen comes in to b3. So the queen on e6 is unprotected. The big threat here is rook d8 with a discovered check, trying to win material. So the queen goes back to c8 anyway, and now queen c4. Step by step, white is improving her position. Very nice positional chess. And now black goes queen to e8. And the big question also is how to proceed. What is going to be next? White is better on the d-file, on the queen side, but probably that's not going to be enough to break through. So a typical strategy in such cases is try to make it more difficult for the defender to put up resistance by creating a second front. And that's actually what's going to happen now. White plays g3, and after queen c8, pawn on h3 is hanging. King g2, very solid move. Queen e8, black basically has absolutely no idea of what to do here. And now white goes h4. So the pawn is going forward. Maybe in certain cases it will come to h5, although not now because the queen covers it. And still, I'm pretty sure that black should just have waited here with a move like queen c8, and things are not going to be easy. But typical mistake on move 40, just one move before the time control. Black played here this move h5 herself to stop the advance of the h-pawn. But this pawn is going to be a clear target. Let's have a look what happens now. Bishop d2. Bishop had done his job. It's coming back so that after rook b8, the move f4 is played. Very nice attack here as we are opening up the king side. We are attacking the pawn on e5. E takes f4, and now you do recapture with the bishop rather than the pawn just try to keep your king as safe as possible. Rook is under threat. Rook went to b7. And now the move queen to e2. Together with the rook, the queen is hitting the pawn on h5. And definitely you don't want to lose that pawn. So black plays g6. And here e5. White is now breaking through via the center. And black is really having a difficult time here. If you do take on e5, the queen is gonna take. And there are massive threats. Particularly the idea of entering with your queen on h8. The rook is vulnerable. Very unlikely black is gonna survive this. Even plans of rook d2, rook e2, setting up a massive pin. The bishop can come to g5 or even h6. This is not looking great. So instead, black thought, let's play here the move queen a8 with a nice potential pin on this long diagonal. And of course, if you do take the pawn, which was not played, and rightly so, there is rook d7 and your rook is pinned, cannot move. You can capture the bishop with check, but after king e8, you cannot avoid the loss of a rook. So that would be a serious mistake. After queen a8, a much better option here is to play queen f3 to neutralize the pin. And well, in certain cases, you do have some specific ideas with that rook. For instance, if you do take the pawn, one very nice idea here is to play bishop g5 with a discovered check. If you go king e8, there's rook takes e5. This looks totally crushing, as the rook on b7 is out of play. The queen is too far away. While in case of king g8, there is rook d7 with a huge pin on the rook. The rook cannot be taken because of queen takes a8. While in case of bishop takes g5, you can take on b7. But even nicer is, of course, to give a check on f7, king h8, and deliver checkmate. So here you see how nicely White's ideas on all sides of the board were basically mixed into one crushing mating attack. Of course, black didn't want to open up the king side. Instead, tried to keep it closed with the move f5. But now rook d7 is played anyway. The rook is pinned, cannot be taken. The rook got a move and protect the queen, so it went to a7. And there are various ways of playing. You can still try to play for an attack here with something like bishop h6. If you go king e8 to keep the bishop defended, rook takes a7, queen takes a7, e6. With the idea to enter with your queen looks incredibly dangerous and is probably just crushing with a very nice attack, as black's king has almost no squares to go to. But instead, Lee wanted to play it safe and thought, okay, I don't have to win in the attack. I can just trade off the queens to prevent any counterplay anytime. Queens come off the board, and the endgame is also just really huge because this pawn on e6, together with this rook and the bishop, weak pawns on the queen side, this should be winning as well. Black played here the move rook takes a4, very understandable. But now rook b7 is on the board, and you do have a big threat here. Let's say if you play something like c4, you can give a check, king g7, bishop e5, and if you go into the corner, it is rook h8 with checkmate. So, and if you play something like bishop f6 instead, you can just give a check, and on the next move you pick up the bishop. So with rook b7, you're threatening rook b8. Therefore, the rook has to go back to a8. But now you take the pawn on b6, and now white all of a sudden has two passed pawns. Black played c4, looking for counterplay, and here very human way of converting the advantage here is rook c6 was played in the game. Machine also likes rook a6 with the idea that the pawn is unstoppable. If the rook goes away, you just run with your b pawn, and the bishop is covering the queening square. Looks very, very strong as well. But after rook c6, you're also threatening b6, b7. The rook is behind the passed pawn, so that pawn is not dangerous at all. Black played bishop d8, and now b6. The threat is to go b7, hitting the rook, and b8 queen as the bishop protects the pawn. Rook a2 check, king f3, rook b2. Now the pawn is under threat. But here rook c8. Now the bishop is in trouble. Bishop cannot really go anywhere because of the pin. In case of rook b3, it's king e2. And now if you do play king e7, there's bishop g5, and on the next move the bishop will be taken with a dead lost endgame. In the game, Zhu decided, okay, I'm going to lose the bishop anyway, let's take the pawn just to be sure. But his endgame, after rook takes d8, king e7, rook c8, the rook comes back behind the passed pawn, rook takes e6 with check, king will come over, so that after rook e4, the king comes to c3, rook takes c4 is the idea, and this endgame is just going to be lost. If rooks are going to be exchanged, you just have an extra piece. These pawns, they are fixed. They can never move. They are unable to create a passed pawn. So with the help of an extra piece, black will always get in zugzwang. The remaining endgame is lost. Rook e8 was played. Rooks stayed on the board, but there's rook c7 check, king f6, bishop g5. And now the problem is that the king has only 2 squares. If it goes to e6, there is rook to g7, and the pawn on g6 is going to drop, and later on the other pawns will fall as well. So in the end, there the followed king to e5, so that you have the option of playing rook e6 if the pawn comes under threat. But now rook e7 is a much simpler way of converting. After rook takes e7, bishop takes e7, black resigned, because the bishop can just get back in time to the f4 square to support its own pawns, to prevent black from advancing its own g-pawn, and therefore the endgame is just lost. This is the first win of the match, and it means that Lei Tingjie is taking the lead. Now, after 4 draws, it's 3 versus 2. There are still 7 games to go, and definitely we will see much more action. Now, Zhu Wenjun, the reigning world champion, is 1 point behind and needs to try to make a win in one of the next games. I thought this was a very instructive game. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and then definitely we are back with more coverage of this exciting World Championship match between the 2 best women in the world, both from China.